5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9. Go SpaceX, go Starlink.
Over the past 5 years, Elon Musk's SpaceX has deployed thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit, enabling high-speed internet access in nearly every corner of the globe. While satellite internet has been around for years, Starlink stands out for its speed and reliability, setting it apart from competitors. From Harare to Lagos, demand for Starlink has been overwhelming, with the service selling out in many of Africa's largest metropolitan areas. The company's availability map indicates strong adoption in several African nations, where it has secured operating licenses. However, securing regulatory approval in African and Asian countries has been a slow process. Starlink remains unlicensed across most of these continents, limiting its expansion. In South Africa, prospects for a launch appear bleak. Despite Musk's apparent determination to push Starlink into the country, regulatory hurdles remain a significant barrier. Recent developments suggest that the service may never receive the necessary approvals to operate there. While both SpaceX and Amazon's Project Kuiper largely supported ICASA's framework, they acknowledged that based on their interpretation, they would still require an individual electronic communications network service license. This means they would not be able to bypass the 30% local ownership requirement. Amazon recognizes that the inquiry specifically pertains to the spectrum licensing regime and associated fees without altering the existing service licensing regulations under the Electronic Communications Act, 36 of 2005. However, Amazon Web Services has secured a Level 1 BBBE status, allowing it to operate legally and freely in South Africa. Starlink, on the other hand, has refused to comply with these regulations and appears unwilling to adapt to local requirements. The South African government, meanwhile, has shown little interest in making exceptions for the company. Ironically, the government was initially considering a more flexible approach that could have facilitated Starlink's entry. The Minister of Communications had been working on a policy directive that would provide alternatives to the 30% equity ownership rule within the telecommunications sector. In simpler terms, other industries have implemented equity-equivalent measures, allowing foreign companies to contribute to South Africa's socio-economic development in alternative ways. A similar approach could have opened the door for Starlink, but that opportunity now seems increasingly unlikely. SpaceX, the company behind Starlink, has stated that South Africa's BEE ownership rules pose a major obstacle to its plans to operate in the country. In a 16-page submission to the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, SpaceX criticized the country's satellite service licensing framework, arguing that the current regulations prevent them from entering the market. Under South African law, companies providing services directly to end users must obtain IECNS and IECS licenses, which require at least 30% ownership by historically disadvantaged groups. SpaceX confirmed in its submission that this requirement is the primary reason it has been blocked from operating locally. As an alternative, the company proposed an equity equivalence program, which would allow operators to make financial contributions towards socio-economic transformation instead of meeting the ownership requirement. Their proposed initiative includes donating Starlink equipment to schools and libraries in rural areas at no cost, claiming this could revolutionize internet access in historically underserved regions where traditional network operators struggle to operate profitably. However, SpaceX has not clarified whether these institutions would also receive free monthly internet access, or if they would still need to pay for a subscription. Additionally, many schools and libraries in remote areas are isolated, raising concerns about the feasibility and impact of this approach. It is hypocritical for many white South Africans and mainstream media outlets to suddenly advocate for Starlink under the guise of helping rural communities, especially when these same voices have historically shown little concern for these areas. The entire narrative feels like a coordinated effort to convince the public that South Africa desperately needs Starlink, despite Vodacom already providing fast and reliable connectivity. While some areas do require satellite internet, South Africa can afford to wait for China's version of Starlink and grant it the necessary licenses instead. Allowing Starlink into the country's telecommunications network poses a risk given Elon Musk's growing ties to right-wing groups and his alleged role in destabilizing South Africa's diplomatic standing. Starlink has been criticized for undermining national governments' control over their own communications. Instead of empowering ordinary citizens, It has consolidated power in the hands of private billionaires. During the war in Ukraine, Musk alone determined whether the Ukrainian military had the internet access necessary for battlefield operations. Pentagon officials had to negotiate directly with him to ensure continued Starlink service. Notably, Musk denied Ukraine the ability to carry out a surprise attack on Russian forces in Crimea, citing concerns over a potential nuclear response from Russia. Given this precedent, South Africans cannot trust Musk with the country's data security. The last thing the nation needs is an individual who could unilaterally disable internet access while spreading misinformation about the country. These factors make it nearly impossible for the government to approve Starlink. Moreover, Starlink will not address the real challenges facing rural communities. Many schools in these areas lack basic infrastructure, books, and even functional toilets, with some still struggling with severe classroom shortages. Those pushing for Starlink should be transparent about their true intentions. When they say rural, they are likely referring to farms, lodges, and game reserves, rather than impoverished villages. One of Starlink's biggest backers in South Africa is AfriForum, which claims the satellite network would be transformative for rural education and security. However, it's important to clarify that the rural communities AfriForum is concerned with are primarily small Afrikaans-speaking enclaves in remote towns that struggle with network coverage. Starlink would almost certainly thrive in South Africa, exceptionally well, in fact. Beyond its success across the rest of the continent, there is clear evidence that demand for the service is strong within South Africa itself. For years, many South Africans accessed Starlink by taking advantage of its roaming packages from other countries. By paying an additional fee, users could utilize Starlink services outside the country where the package was originally purchased. As a result, people acquired Starlink kits abroad and used them locally, despite this being against regulations. This loophole fueled a booming underground market, with several businesses emerging to import Starlink kits and manage services for local customers. Eventually, SpaceX cracked down on these unauthorized users, leading to the suspension of roaming packages across Africa. The future of Starlink in South Africa looks uncertain, especially given Musk's impact on the country's relationship with the US. While the long-term outlook is unclear, one thing is certain. For now, Starlink will not benefit poor South Africans in rural areas, at least not in the next decade.